Welcome to the another video lecture of this series. In the previous lecture, we have learnt about communication, its process, features and significance, levels and other important topics. Today, we are going to discuss the another important topic of communication, that is barriers to communication. Now, when we listen the term barriers, what does the very first thing that comes to our mind? What is the first thing that strikes our mind? Maybe any stoppage, maybe any hindrance, maybe anything that stops or controls. So there may be different interpretations of the word barriers in different terminology. In communication terminology, the word has something the same meaning. It may stand for anything that distorts our message. In fact, it is important to know about barriers to communication so that we can avoid them while communicating. Therefore, anything in any form that distorts the message sent or received may be termed as barriers to communication. It is also known as noise. While making communication, sometimes the sender remains unable to convey his message to the another person, and this results into miscommunication. For example, sometimes you just want to say something positive to someone you know, but he takes you otherwise. He is unable to understand you, what you just want to say. Here you try to explain, my means was not that. I wanted to say that. You are taking me otherwise. This is the problem of misunderstanding, because the another person is not understanding. Now take the another example. Suppose you are talking to your senior about your project. Meanwhile, the another employee comes and starts talking to your boss. Now your boss pays attention to what does he say. After his departure, your boss turns to you and asks suddenly, "Yes, what were you saying?" Now you feel your boss has not heeded on what you said. You feel amazed and surprised. This is the problem of not understanding. So what do you learn from these situations? Although there are a number of barriers to communication, here in this lecture we are going to discuss some major ones. According to the nature, barriers can be divided into 4 categories. First, linguistic or semantic barriers. Second, psychological barriers. Third, organizational barriers. And fourth, personal barriers. Now let us discuss the first, linguistic or semantic barriers. Literally, the word linguistic means language and semantics means meaning. Therefore, linguistic or semantic barriers are those barriers which result from language or meaning related mistakes. Sometimes the speaker or the writer creates these barriers because of these certain mistakes, like unclear sentences. Sometimes the speaker himself creates this barrier by using unclear words, sentences, message, idea, etc., which is not intelligible to the receiver. Therefore, this is one of the language barriers. Poor grammar. These barriers are created because of grammatical, syntactic, punctuation, morphological, and sense of expression mistake. A person in an organization receives information from different channels and sends the same to the others. In this process, the message is molded again and again according to the intelligibility of the recipient, and a little carelessness in the translation can result into barriers to communication. The another language barrier is specialized language. This barrier is created because of highly specialized terminology, words, phrases, or jargons of a particular field or subject. Every profession has its different technical terminology and is hard to understand by all. This special terminology sometimes creates barriers to communication. The another language barrier is unclarified assumptions. This barrier is created because of speakers' unclarified ideas or assumptions regarding the masses, or sometimes the speaker takes it for granted. That is, the receiver has the idea of the masses what is being conveyed. The another important barrier is psychological barriers. Psychological barriers are very significant impediment in communication. These are, number one, difference in attitude and values. As you know, all are not alike is an apt saying. That means different people have different attitudes towards a particular thing. This attitude results into difference in perception, and this difference in perception leads to barriers to communication. The story of 6 blind Burmese is the best example here. Each blind Burmese was right according to his perception about the elephant, but it is not according to the other. So these type of different perceptions lead to barriers to communication. Lack of attention is another psychological barriers. Barriers are not only created by the speakers, but are also created by the recipient or the audience. Sometimes the receiver is preoccupied with some urgent piece of work, and due to this, he remains unable to understand the message attentively. Therefore, it causes barriers in communication process. Howsoever the speaker is cogent and effective, he cannot be effective until or unless the receiver listens him attentively. The another important psychological barrier is excessive emotions. Good speakers always avoid themselves from excess of emotions, because this excess of emotions leads to barriers to communication. This stops communication. Effective communication has a good blend of reason and emotions. The another important distrust is a major psychological barrier to communication. Distrust is a major psychological barrier to communication. Trust plays an important role between the speaker and the receiver, If there is no trust between both of them, both parties will get the message otherwise. This prejudice between them leads to miscommunication. The another type of barriers is organizational barriers. The barriers that occur inside the organization are called organizational barriers. There are some important organizational barriers which we must understand. The first and the foremost is negative organizational climate. Effective or ineffective communication depends upon organizational climate. If it is positive, the communication shall be positive and healthy. It would be fruitful too. Or if it is negative, the communication will be ineffective. Therefore, the negative attitude of the top level employees and executives discourages communication in the organization. Status is the second important organizational barrier. In fact, communication is affected by status. The barrier arises when people of different status communicate. For example, the general manager sometimes hardly pays attention towards the suggestion from his subordinates, and this is only because of difference in status. Therefore, for example, the general manager sometimes hardly pays attention towards the suggestion from his subordinates, and this is only because of difference in status. Therefore, hierarchy in the organization is one of the common factors of miscommunication. The other is one-way flow. One-way flow of communication is another barrier to communication because the sender doesn't get the feedback from the audience or the listeners. Rules and regulations. Sometimes the speaker is troubled by some fixed and definite rules and remains able to send the message. Therefore, too much rules and regulations in communication is another important barrier to communication. The other type of organizational barriers is distance barriers. Distance is another important barrier to communication, no doubt. As you know, the more is the distance between the people, the less is the communication. Last important barrier is physical barrier. Network problem in mobile phone, internet problem or noisy restaurant can destroy communication. In such case, the receiver may not understand it properly. So the another category of barriers to communication is personal barriers. And they are of 8 types which are here. Attitude of superiors. Attitude of the superiors is the main barriers to communication. If superior have positive attitude, they have a smooth communication with their junior ones. And if they have negative attitude, then they have a problem in communication. So attitude of superiors is one of the main barriers to personal communication. So attitude of superiors is one of the important factors that affects communication. Lack of confidence in subordinates. This barrier results when the seniors develop attitude that the juniors are less capable of. This attitude results from lack of confidence in juniors. The junior takes for granted that his communication or idea will not be entertained by his boss. So this type of lack of confidence is one of the barriers to effective communication. The another is insistence of proper channel. Sometimes it is the hierarchy or protocol or proper channel approach which causes barriers to communication. The another important barrier is ignoring communication. Now this is a major problem in communication. Some people ignore communication that restricts communication process and results into ineffective communication. So if one has effective communication or one listens to the others very effectively, he can just make his communication effective. The another is too much filtration of information. Now we technical people have to filter the information because whenever we have overloaded masses, we have to cut it short. But too much filtration of information sometimes leads to barriers to communication because sometimes we leave important information in filtration process. So filtration is the important, of course it is important in technical communication or business communication we have, but too much filtration makes the message obscure, hard to understand, and sometimes elusive, which finally leads to communication barriers. So try to avoid too much filtration of information. The another is insufficient time. Effective communication requires sufficient time. Therefore, lack of time is one of the major barriers to effective communication. The another important and the last one is overloaded masses. Sometimes we have a big masses. We have masses overload or information overload. And we have not sufficient time. So it becomes a challenge to say that particular or to transmit that particular huge or overloaded masses to the audience within the limited time. So it is one of the important impediments in effective communication. Thank you.